We're doing a study, what we're calling How to Live a Happy Life. How to Live a Happy Life, and we're looking at the book of Ecclesiastes. We're to the second chapter, and this particular lesson is called Eat, Drink, and Be What? In other words, it doesn't end the way that Solomon thought it was going to end. As I said, we're studying Solomon's pursuit of the question, what makes a profit with our lives? In this particular chapter, in chapter 2, Solomon turns his attention to pleasure. He's looked at the creation, did not find the answer he's looking for there. So now he's going to pursue this question, how to make a profit with your life, looking at pleasure. In other words, let's have a party, and nobody can party like a king. And this man is the richest of all kings. So he becomes the humanist playboy. And I want to try to phrase this as accurately as I possibly can, because what he did here, I certainly wouldn't suggest anybody doing. But Solomon, in his pursuit, he went to this extreme, to this length of doing it. He becomes a playboy in his search for happiness. He turns his attention to pleasure, and all of it is based on this question, what makes life worth living? What gives it a profit in making it worth living? As I said, I would not recommend anyone to go down this road, but Solomon is going to take us down this road and prove it is a dead-end street. The first part of this lesson I'm going to call the pursuit of pleasure. The pursuit of pleasure. And what Solomon does, it's the old saying, if it feels good, do it. And so he's a playboy philosophy is what he is attempting here. And it did not work out for him. He fills the palace, and here's the richest king, so he can bring in the best of entertainers. He fills the palaces with games, with laughter, and he comes to the conclusion it's madness or it's crazy. This isn't going to answer my question. It profits nothing. The pursuit of pleasure. Now, he tests what we would call wine, women, and song. And remember, this is a test. He's deliberately doing this. He doesn't become an alcoholic or a drunkard, but it's obvious he takes his time, drinking and partying. He doesn't become just an immoral, lustful man that's chasing every woman, but he certainly pushes the legal boundaries as far as he can go. Anybody that has 700 wives and 300 concubines is certainly pushing the boundary. And so this man he's experimenting with life to try to see, as I said, he pushes it to the extreme as far as he can, one direction, the extreme the other direction, and then draws the conclusion out of the middle. He imports the finest of wine, and he's got the money to do it. He brings in the most beautiful women from all the surrounding countries. This man is not just a king, but as I said, he is using the playboy philosophy. Because if this is what makes life worth living, then he's going to live it up. He's going to live it to its maximum. He fills the palace with musicians and entertainers. As I said, it is one big party. And he talks all about this here in this second chapter. But every time he comes back to this word saying, this isn't it. This is crazy. This is not the answer I'm looking for. And so this world's richest king now becomes known as the world's greatest of lovers. Now, I question his wisdom in doing all of this. Remember, the wisdom he had is what we would call political science. He knew how to make money. He knew how to run a kingdom. He knew, how to establish a prosperous society. But this man doesn't make a good father. He certainly doesn't set a godly example. So it's not godly wisdom. It's a natural wisdom of knowing how to run a country. And this is Solomon. But the problem for Solomon, every time the party's over, and sooner or later it will be, when the night is finished, the next morning, and no doubt he had to deal with a few hangovers, when the party's over, he's faced with the same old question. What makes life worth living? What did it profit? And he comes to the conclusion that there is no profit in pleasure. Pleasure is a passing vanity. Oh, yes, enjoy life. And he talks about this later, that this is one of the things that God has given to us as a gift, that it's good to enjoy life. But if you're pursuing pleasure, you're going to live a life of disappointment, because that is not what's going to make life worth living. In other words, parties don't make money. Parties cost money. Somebody has to pay for all the entertainment, all the food. There's no profit in it. And this is why he comes to the conclusion that this is madness. We're spending all this money, we're doing all of this, but it did not profit one thing. Boy, I think this is something that we need to communicate with a lot of young people today, because there's a lot of young people that get caught up in this trap, thinking that what life is all about is a party. Live to party. And it's a foolish pursuit, because you're going to be chasing it continually. It's like chasing the wind. And when you come to the end of your life, there's nothing to show for it. It's all gone. And that's what Solomon said. His conclusion is, in the pursuit of pleasure, it's vanity, it's madness, it's crazy, because it does not profit anything. Now, the second part of this lesson, I'm going to call it the pursuit of possessions. The pursuit of possessions, because he turns his attention from pleasure to building projects. And he becomes the greatest of all the builders of Israel. Nobody ever built the things that he built. In fact, they still talk about Solomon's temple. They put his name on it because, this magnificent structure that he builds, he becomes known as that, as the builder. His father was known as the warrior king. He's known as the builder. And so he goes about this again. He pushes it to the maximum, to the limits, to the extremes. He builds palaces, he builds temples, and these are architectural wonders of the world, things that people still talk about to this day. Solomon built them. He built buildings that lasted for hundreds of years. In fact, if you go to Israel today, and I've had the privilege of going there several times, you can go and still see some of the things that Solomon built during his days, the pools of Solomon. And this man was not only an amazing king, but he really knew how to go to the extreme with things. So as an architect, he builds a throne which left you speechless. And I take that from the book of 1 Kings, the 10th chapter, verse 4 and 5. The queen of Sheba comes to see him, and she said, when I saw his throne and I saw the entrance into the house of God, I was speechless. I couldn't say anything. Now, that's quite an accomplishment when you can impress the queen so much that she is speechless. But that's the kind of building projects that he takes on. He begins planting flowers, and again, he's importing a lot of this into the country. He makes gardens, things that the world had never seen before. He is building these things, and it's all in pursuit of this question, Is this what makes life worth living? Is this what gives a profit to life? That's what he is seeking after. He plants forests. He builds elaborate fountains of water. I just mentioned seeing the huge area that's excavated there in the huge walls. That it looks like warehouses in the ground that were pools that he would bring water into the city. It would run into these so that he could irrigate all his gardens, so he could have these beautiful fountains operating. The man was a genius when it come to knowing how to build architectural wonders. He builds lakes and became the greatest rancher that Israel had ever known. He writes about it in his book, and he said, I had greater herds than anyone before me. Nobody has ever done it like Solomon did it. And yet, the end result is, this is not a prophet. This is not the answer. Because he is a wealthy king, he adds to what he calls his treasure of kings. In other words, those were the things nobody else could buy but Solomon, the treasure of kings. It was to the point, for instance, all of his drinking glasses were made out of gold. Gold. In fact, it says of Solomon that he had brought so much gold into the city, and it's because they were located on the trade routes, and he knew how to make money. He had wisdom. He was smart. He knew how to tax and how to raise revenue. There's a lot of politicians, I'm sure, that would follow his example here. But the Bible says that money was so plenteous in Jerusalem that silver was treated like a common stone. Now that, you got to remember, you're reading the Bible. And yet he says that silver was basically worthless. It was like a common stone. And if you ever go to Israel, you're going to find out they've got plenty of stones there. It's stones everywhere. I used to wonder why they would stone people to death. And when I went to Israel, it became obvious why they stoned them to death. They got more rocks than anything else. And yet it said, during the kingdom of Solomon, silver was like a common stone in the street. Boy, this man is pushing it to the maximum. And he thinks he has arrived. He thinks this is it. This is what I've been looking for. Or is the word that's used so many times, Eureka, I found it, I found it. But he didn't find it. And to his disappointment, one day he looks in the mirror, and the mirror says, you're not getting any younger. What he discovers, there's gray in his beard. There's gray in his hair. And that pushes him back to the point that now he must reevaluate everything he has built. He said, I've worked so hard, and yet I'm going to leave it to another man that didn't raise his finger to build it. And who knows whether he will be wise or not. Oh, what Solomon is discovering is this life cannot bring the fulfillment that we're seeking for spiritually. It can bring a lot of natural fulfillment. And being rich is certainly better than being poor. Being healthy is better than being sick. But if all we have is just this life, when it's over, friend. And that's what Solomon is forced back. He thinks that he's found the solution in the pursuit of possessions, only to discover you're going to die and leave it all to somebody else. Leave it all behind. And so the third part of the lesson that I want to focus upon is what I'm going to call the pursuit of purpose. The pursuit of purpose. Solomon has realized, by looking in the mirror and seeing the gray in his hair, that one day I will die and I will leave it all to my son. And who knows whether he will be wise or not. History records it. Solomon's son was not wise. The first thing he did was divide the kingdom. And it never really recovered from that. The glory days had just ended, and Solomon had only been dead for a few hours. My, what a tragedy. And yet there are so many people that make Solomon's mistake, that they leave it all behind to someone that is not prepared to handle it. So what Solomon has become, he's become what I would call the unhappy humanist. And if all there is in life is just what meets the eye, if all there is just right now, then ultimately you're going to find yourself unhappy as well. Because unless there's something beyond this life, then why are we sacrificing? Solomon comes to the conclusion that a life that is lived without God ends in a cold box in the ground. That's all you have left. If all that you have is living right now, one day it's all going to be over. That's why he is so unhappy. And he's frustrated with it, saying, I've invested everything. I've worked hard. I've done my best. And yet I have nothing but to leave it behind to somebody else that didn't even work for it. And who knows whether he will do good or whether he will waste it. The truth is, one day, every one of us will face death. It will happen sooner or later. It's ultimate. It's going to happen. And unless there's something beyond this life, that leaves us empty. That leaves us unfulfilled. Unless there is something that is beyond what we can put our hands on, what we can see with the natural eye, then ultimately we will come up empty-handed just like Solomon, because it will all end in the graveyard unless we have hope beyond this life. See, the rich and the poor, the wise and the fool, they all meet together in one place. That's at the graveyard. It doesn't matter how wise you are, and Solomon was wise in so many ways in the way that he conducted himself, the kingdom that he built. It was magnificent. No one had ever done anything like that before. And yet, if that's all there is, ultimately it comes up empty, because we all will die. The Apostle Paul said this, and the Apostle Paul is one of the most spiritual men. He knew God in a way that very few people ever know God. And yet, here's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 and 19. If in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men the most pitiable. Now, that's the Apostle Paul talking. That's not an ordinary preacher. That's the man that wrote half of the New Testament. That's the man that started more churches than anybody else in the New Testament. And yet he's saying, if this is all there is, if this is the only hope we have right now in this life, then we are to be pitied above everybody else. I had to face that myself many years ago. And I came to that conclusion. And I do not live for right now. I live for eternity. I live for eternity because I believe there is more than this. I believe there is hope after the funeral. I do believe that there is a resurrection. I believe in eternal life. But I had to face the fact that if this is not true, then I am a fool. And I have thrown away the opportunities that I had in life just to enjoy myself, to have pleasure, all the different things that people pursue after. But the older I live, the more fulfilled I am, and the happier I become. I am not to be pitied. I rejoice in the life that God has given to me. So the fourth thing I want to talk about is Solomon's conclusion. His conclusion to all of this, and I think this is something that we need to share with all those that are around us, and particularly with younger people. And I think this whole book is written like addressed to college-age kids that are thinking of their life and what they're going to do with their life. His conclusion is, the answer that I am seeking cannot be found in man. Therefore, it must be found in God. In other words, he's deducting his conclusion from, I pushed it to the extremes. Here's the conclusion. I cannot find it in this life, so there must be a life beyond this world. I cannot find it in myself, so the answer's not here. The answer must be in God. That's good reasoning. That is very good reasoning. So he said, I've tried everything that this life has to offer a man, and I've still come up empty. Empty. It's not there. So what he's learned is a life that is lived without God is worthless. Now, I've come to the point in my life, I've been preaching now for 60 years, and it's given me time and opportunity to evaluate a lot of things. I've asked a lot of questions. I've traveled around the world hundreds of times and always looking, searching, and asking questions about people, about the way they live, why they do that, why this culture is this way, and trying to come up with answers. And I've come to the same conclusion. Without God, this life is not worth living. Without God, there's no lasting happiness. Solomon's discovered that even the ability to enjoy life is a gift from God. God is the one that gives that to you. And I've seen people that are happy that had very little, and I've seen others that had a lot and were very unhappy. And for instance, have you ever gone to a party? A party's supposed to be a place of pleasure. And you go to the party and a fight breaks out at the party. Somebody gets hurt at the party. I remember several years ago there was the Vietnam War was taking place here in the United States, and there was these peace rallies that were taking place around the country, and someone very well said, be careful about those peace rallies. You can get hurt at a peace rally. And we know what they're saying. The same thing about parties. And yet so many unhappy people, they even fight at a party. So the truth is, and this is Solomon's conclusion, without God, there is no lasting happiness. You leave God out, you've left out the essential part that makes life worth living. Without God within our lives, then our lives are just, they're going nowhere. It's an endless cycle that one day in the monotony of life will be over. And how tragic that so many people come to the end of their life with not only nothing to show for it, but many of them, it's just misery. And they make everybody that's around them miserable. That's not God's will, friend. That is not God's will. Solomon discovers it is God that gives us wisdom, knowledge, and joy. Without God within our lives, none of those things are ultimately going to make sense. And yet those that are right with God, those that are what he calls good in his sight, in God's sight, God gives those things to them. And I've seen it in my travels, so many people that others might feel sorry for them. Well, they're so poor or such, and yet they are happier than people that have feast on their tables. They sing and rejoice. I've seen it. Oh my, they have taught me how to live because Christ is everything to them. He is everything. And they're not feeling sorry for themselves. No, they're rejoicing in all the blessings that God has given to them. Someone has well said it best, that the man lives best whose toys are simplest. I think that is so true, that a cold drink of water brings such pleasure if you're right with God. You don't have to get drunk to enjoy life. You don't have to, no. You can take and turn a simple meal into a feast if your heart is right with God. But if it's not, the poor sinner, he's in a bad condition. He is like grasping for the wind, trying to make a profit out of life. He's struggling. He's conniving. He's trying, to cheat everybody else so he can get ahead. What a sad way to live. Solomon says that is a foolish pursuit. In the end, the sinner is going to leave everything behind to the one who pleases God. What an amazing conclusion for this wealthiest of all kings. He's saying the person that lives righteously, the person that pleases God, is the person that's going to end up the winner in life. Without God, life doesn't make sense, and there is no lasting purpose. But when God is within our life, you find even the wealth of the sinner is laid up for the just. Proverbs 13:22. What a blessing that God has promised to us. And so I challenge you, you don't have to do all this pursuit of happiness, pursuit of pleasure and possessions that Solomon did. He's already did it to the maximum, better than you and I could ever do it. He had more money, more resources, and he pushed it to the extreme. His conclusion is, if you leave God out, then you've left out the thing that makes life worth living. Don't make that mistake. Continue what we call the journey of faith, following after God. And if you do, God will bless you and you will live a rich, full life. May God bless you on your Christian journey.